David is an Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Heritage. Welcome, David.
Many thanks, May, for your kind welcome. I have fond memories of having my own meetings with Nigel Seeley many, many years ago. It's always good to start a journey with an idea of which way to go. I hope you agree. And so unashamedly, I give 3 definitions of conservation as the foundation for much of my work and the subject of this evening's lecture. Of particular note is action with regard to any other thing of acknowledged value for the future, as this raises the question of what we might value today and what our children and children's children might value in years to come. Managing change has become the axiom for the art or science of conservation, but as Sidney Harris said, our dilemma is that we hate change, yet love it at the same time. What we really want is for things to remain the same, but get better. As we move towards the end of 2015, it's interesting to reflect on changes that have taken place within the heritage sector over recent years, and to consider how our emphasis has shifted or widened so that all aspects of the historic environment, both tangible and intangible, come under the spotlight. As has been highlighted by Paul Drury, conservation is very much an evolving concept. This isn't about what we do or not do can have far-reaching consequences for a building, monument or site. This is all the more pertinent when working on something with demonstrable value and significance. Add to this the overarching burden of sustainability, and one begins to understand the responsibilities we have for current and future generations. With every project there is the weight of numerous demands and the anguish of balancing often conflicting requirements before achieving a semblance of calm or acquiescence. The blank stare may, of course, be that of exasperation or madness. The blank stare may persist when faced not with a building, but simply the remains of a building or just a limited physical evidence of former settlement, industry or belief. This leads me into the subject of this lecture. How do we set about conserving the standing remains of buildings and monuments so that they can pay their way and have a place in our future? Does it matter? As a nation, we're becoming more conversant with our past, largely through television and film. But does entertainment translate into action? Only last week, with the publication of Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register, concern has been expressed about the damage being caused to prehistoric burial mounds through the activities of mammals, quite often protected species such as badgers, farmers as custodians of the countryside, and the weather affecting both biodiversity and farming practices. Part of the answer to this problem is through the work of volunteers such as the publicised group in the Cotswolds who have taken personal rather than corporate responsibility for their heritage. With changing priorities and reducing budgets, community engagement and activity must inevitably provide a model for safeguarding what matters into the future. But what does matter, and does what matters today remain valid next year and in years to come? How does somebody brought up in an inner city environment begin to understand and appreciate a countryside that is both alien and seemingly irrelevant? Or the person from a small rural community see the value of a city with its noise, bustle and intimidations? This dislocation has been captured as it affects the Lake District by James Rebanks in his acclaimed book, The Shepherd's Life. Largely, it is about perceptions and prejudices. I'm not intending to pursue this particular strand of discussion, but instead bring matters back to solid ground. A useful starting point for understanding the effects of time on buildings is by seeing architecture, unlike paintings, and to a certain extent sculpture, as existing in time. Quoting Sir Osbert Lancaster, it suffers the effects of wind and weather and the additions and alterations of man. It may be frozen music, but it melts. More robustly put by Peter Ackroyd, nothing destroys antiquity like energy. Nothing blots out the old like the new. It is time to give some examples of buildings and structures to which we might lend a helping hand, or stated so eloquently in the manifesto of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, as to put protection in the place of restoration, to stave off decay by daily care, to prop a perilous wall and mend a leaky roof by such means as are obviously meant for support or covering, and showed no pretence of other art, and otherwise to resist all tampering with either the fabric or ornament of the building as it stands. In today's parlance, we're in the business of safeguarding original fabric. We start our tour with Binham Priory in North Norfolk. The church, or rather the nave that remains as a parish church, is known for its west window, which is perhaps the earliest bar tracery in England. The elevation was built in 1226 to 1244, and the window was bricked in 1809. The site is owned by the Norfolk Archaeological Trust, and the conventual buildings are in the guardianship of English Heritage. The priory was founded in 1091, and aside from the church and the conventual buildings, what you have is the gatehouse, or the remains of the gatehouse, and the precinct wall. Now, some things might strike you. In the middle of the gatehouse, you have a modern bullpen. Good, solid Norfolk farmers' construction, hard to remove. You've also got other items of interest. There's a lot of vegetation growth and a precinct wall along the highway edge, which is extensive and crumbling. Some of the challenges with this project involved that problem of vegetation growth, previous repairs and consolidation carried out by the Ministry of Works with very little recorded evidence of what was done and when. And this is always a problem working on ancient monuments. You never know who's been there before and what they may or may not have done. We have the evidence of modern farming practices with the crush in the bullpen, which is part of the cumulative history of the site, was deemed to be of significance and therefore to be retained. And to make it even more interesting, on the southern side of the wall, we have a Mediterranean plant, a rare species, wool bedstraw. All of these rare plants, unfortunately, look very much like weeds, so it's always difficult to get the contractors to understand this is a nationally scarce plant. So what we did was remove the bullpen, took some removing. We represented the gatehouse for the public with presentation and interpretation. We took off a lot of the previous cement-based repairs and consolidated the upstanding fabric, and we carried out a large degree of reinstatement of flint facing to the precinct wall. So much of the facing had gone, exposing the vulnerable core work to the weather. So by refacing it, you're providing structural integrity and holding it together. Some challenges. In the past, the Highway Authority was blamed for part of the precinct wall falling. So that part of the precinct wall on the top left was rebuilt, and rebuilt to a height decreed by the parochial church council as being the correct height based upon a day when various members in different sized cars drove up and down the road looking out of their window at different heights to ensure they could see the church as they went past. That is what fixed the height of that wall. We, on the wall with that nationally scarce wall bedstraw, created reserves, parts of the wall that were rich in this plant. We consolidated the remainder of the wall, but we left these reserves, so in time we would collect seed and place it on parts of the wall that were consolidated. Unfortunately, the Highway Authority didn't get the memo and they sprayed everything with Roundup. So with a little bit of compensation, we were then able to reinstate the plant on the wall. And at the bottom you can see the former north aisle. The remaining buttresses and parts were consolidated to allow a new build construction to be placed on the footprint of the north aisle to provide kitchen, toilet and exhibition space for the church. A wonderful site to go to. Staying with the theme of precinct walls and moving a little south to Castle Acre, you have here a Cluniac Priory founded in 1089. The Priory's English heritage site, one of its gems in East Anglia, but the difference in land ownership means the precinct and the precinct wall is in separate ownership, currently owned by Holcombe Estate, soon to be passed to the Norfolk Archaeological Trust. The precinct wall is interesting and extensive. It was built in the mid-14th century, earlier than the gatehouse on the site, and partly we think as a response to the attacks that were then taking place on monasteries in the 13th and 14th centuries. There's approximately 14 hectares enclosed within the precinct walls, the walls being about 3 metres in height and constructed in lifts of about 300 to 400 millimetres. And what came to light under, at times, 7 feet of ivy growth on the wall. So when it was removed, it had a perfect imprint of the wall head as you removed it, was a very unusual wall head detail, a coping detail of flint, which is an intractable material as a pyramid, sometimes with a clay tile as an oversail course, a drip, and sometimes not. A detail not seen in that part of East Anglia before. So much of it covered in ivy, so we didn't know what remained. The walls were reported as being almost intact in 1734, and Bloomfield in 1808 said the whole site is enclosed with a lofty stone wall, a good part of which is still standing. It might be standing, but it was leaning, and some of it had fallen over, so on the bottom right you've got a face of a wall that's actually upwards to the sky. So quite a bit of soul searching as to what you can do, and of course these are ancient monuments. You cannot really add or subtract, you can give that helping hand, in this case buttress or buttresses to the leaning section of wall, which is just on the boundary between the site of special scientific interest on the River Nar. So there were a lot of discussions with naturalists where we could and couldn't micropile for those buttresses. And you can see the interest in wallhead detail on that section of wall on the left. Of course, one of the problems of this sort of work, particularly when you have a grant, is that you're forced to carry out the work in the wrong time of the year. So you're working through the winter. So as the residents of Castle Acre said, we turned the place into a shanty town. We had sections of wall under tarpaulins for much of the 12 months that we were doing the work. There were the problems of consolidating core work and perhaps sections of wall that couldn't really be held together with mortar. We adopted a principle of soft capping, so you can see turf was cut from part of the site just outside the scheduled boundary and used to consolidate the wall head rather than using mortar. A lot of interest, a lot of community support from the people in Castle Acre and beyond, so the use of open days just to explain what we were doing were invaluable, and invaluable in getting information back to us, because we found all sorts of interesting things on the site, largely related to tennis. And of course these people said, well, of course in the 40s and 50s there was a tennis court in the precinct. We didn't know anything about it apart from the archaeological evidence of tennis balls. The interest and challenge of working with structural remains, of course, comes in many shapes and sizes. You've seen some already. This is all the more pressing when sites have multiple values and significance. The landscape may contain features of importance that help to tell the story of former lives and activities, such as the snail mounds at Lifton Newbuild, the top left there. The walls, although stripped back to their bare bones of the construction, may provide habitat for animals and plant life, and therefore have natural capital. And the surviving remains of interiors can point to domestic practices and links with past practices as well. Walls seem to be a common theme in much of my work, so I'm going to take you now to Caister St Edmund Roman town, just outside Norwich, and one of the few Roman sites that were not resettled after the Romans left, along with Rochester and Silchester. The capital, the regional capital, was founded in about AD 60, Boudicca was in AD 61, and the walls surrounding the town were built in AD 270, halving the amount of land within to about 15 hectares. The walls with an outer ditch stood to about 7 metres in height, sometimes as up to 4 metres thick with an earth rampart behind. Keep your eye, if you will, please, on the gridiron pattern of streets, the River Tess to the left, and the diagonal street to the top right. And I take you to an aerial photograph showing the remains or subsurface remains. So it's a rich site, and it's continued to have interest from initial excavations in the 1920s right up to University of Nottingham doing geophysical work 2 years ago now on that side. What you've got on the ground are walls that are standing almost to their full height, but as with the other walls you've seen, missing their face, so that vulnerable core work is exposed to the elements. You've got walls that are partially standing, and you've got walls that really are no more than humps and bumps in the ground. The challenges are visitor pressure. It's open 365 days of the year. Wonderful place for dog walking. And the other challenge you can see are sheep. Tend to use sheep under management agreements because there's less pressure on the ground rather than cattle. But sheep do walk on walls and cause damage, as do children. One of the interesting challenges of this site, however, was that on the south rampart, with lime having leached out of the walls over many, many years, we've now got a site which has got species indicative of chalk downland, including nationally scarce clustered clover, another weed-looking rare plant. So you can understand the approach we took: minimum intervention, turf maintenance, seed collection, and use of lime-rich materials. So again, another challenge that one doesn't normally set out on a project thinking you're going to face, having to work also with botanists and ecologists. And moving into the 21st century, this was only installed a matter of days ago, an augmented reality app, so you can walk around with your smartphone and actually get images of what the town would have looked like as you walk around. So it's something new, something innovative that the Trust, as one of the few county trusts holding such a wonderful stock of buildings, is looking at. Moving to churches, Norfolk County Council repaired and consolidated 12 or so ruined churches under their Ruined Churches Repair Project in the 1990s. And you can see some of them, including the wonderful Borsey St James, painted by John Piper. And at the top left, you can see a fascinating day we had when, many, many years ago, the English Heritage Inspector of Ancient Monuments found the Romanesque voussoirs from the arch had fallen, and he collected them and put them in a store. And we were able to bring those voussoirs back onto site and offer them up into the mortar pockets so that we knew that was the correct place they went. But what we found was that some of those Romanesque voussoirs had Anglo-Saxon interlaced carving on the reverse side. So you then have that dilemma: do you put them back on site, or do you take them to a museum, or what? So in the end, I think one or two of the voussoirs with the Anglo-Saxon interlaced carving were put in a museum, and the remainder were reinstated within the arch of the wall. And you can see many were covered by vegetation growth to an extent that you couldn't see the fabric. So a great opportunity to understand the construction and the history of these buildings. Methods of repair were both traditional and at the time innovative and new, but you're always going back to the original construction. How did they do it then, and why should you differ now? And this is one of the questions I pose when people say you've got to have mortar analysis, because that analysis will show you a mortar they used when they built the wall, and the wall had two faces and a roof or a wall head detail to stop the water getting in. Would you really want to use the same mortar for consolidating a ruin with its exposed core work now? Possibly not. One of the churches that stands out head and shoulders above the rest is St Mary's Church, Houghton on the Hill. You can see covered in ivy. It was listed as Grade 2, not because the listing inspector could see it, but because on the Ordnance Survey map it said medieval church. It was used by Satanists at the time. So as part of the project, the ivy was removed, and the decision taken that sufficient of the 18th century roofs that had been put on, both nave and chancel, were of a state that they could be repaired, is altered it from being a ruin to a building with potential beneficial uses. The Satanist angle was interesting. The church wardens, my client, had an agreement with the territorial army, and they would camp in the churchyard at whatever night witches fly and chase off anyone wearing black, which I think involved most of the Goths in Swaffham, and we got into the national press as a result. But we always knew there were wall paintings inside this church. We had an initial assessment carried out, and that came back saying, we think you've got something important. So we had a further, more detailed investigation, and that came back and told us that we've got wall paintings dating from 1090 of international significance and the most important find in the last 30 years, and the church went from grade 2 to grade 1 overnight. So of course, from that moment on, the project was driven by the needs of the wall paintings. And the significance increased. We were having people from European universities coming over to look at these wall paintings. The local community was finding they were having the bed and breakfast that had been empty for so long, suddenly taken up by all these academics, for instance, who were coming over to see. So we started on, and this is probably a 15-year project, research and analysis with various organisations, starting with what perhaps the church looked like, using engravings and postcards and photographs. So you can see on those two images on the left the way that window on the south side of the nave had changed. And you've got evidence actually of the former south aisle, where they literally punched holes through the nave wall, mortared it rather than having an arcade with piers, and then decided they didn't want it anymore. So they built up the holes that they knocked through the wall and trapped in that layer of plaster around the arches, so you can see it clearly today. We looked at the way that surface water was moving both away from and towards the walls of the church. Important because the wall paintings go down to ground level, inside and floor level within the building. We looked at environmental monitoring, and the received wisdom then, and to a degree now, was that we should ventilate these structures. We've got honeycomb brick blocking in the windows, largely to stop people getting in, but to allow ventilation. But what the monitoring showed was that we were getting warm, moist air coming in and condensing on the cold masonry surfaces, leading to condensation on those surfaces with the wall paintings. So that then pushed us down the road of reinstating the windows, largely based on a lot of that evidence from engravings and photographs we've just seen. We looked at the plaster layers and the iconography, and there's 5 or 6 layers, one on top of the other, each one hacked and keyed for the next. So a lot of damage has been done over the years, and of course my client, the church warden, said, take it all off, we want to see that 1090 scheme. We don't know if it's there, of course. And each layer has value and significance of its own. We looked at the distribution of microbiological growth on salts as part of the decay processes taking place, and we looked at pigment analysis to try and understand how these paintings would have looked. Now they're remarkable for their survival, but what we understand is they're not particularly remarkable in terms of the artistic merit. Many of the churches in the area may well have had similar paintings. It just happens that this is one of the few that survived. So at the end of a very long project, we managed with grant aid to consolidate and conserve the wall paintings, and you can imagine you have a spectrum of actions: strip off and reveal the earliest scheme at one end, do nothing at the other. And we nudged that do nothing to basic consolidation and reintegration, but allowing us the luxury of removing those cement-based plugs that were acting as salt reservoirs. And it's with all of these type of projects, the importance comes in the interpretation and presentation and the intellectual access. So with the website, we were able to commission 3-dimensional modelling and visualisation for people so they can go and see the paintings without leaving their homes. One of the pleasures of working with historic buildings or those of traditional construction is seeing the use of local materials as a practical method of or solution for particular needs, and the way the methods change around the country. So you've got the highest end of the bricklaying craft, the tuck pointing, and next to it the conceit of mathematical tiling, intended to look like brickwork, but actually tiles on a backing. You've got cherry picking with cinders, almost like galleting. You've got mortar shock masonry, something from the Pennines, where instead of these stone blocks being placed flat, they're tilted slightly, the idea being that wind-driven rain will then flow out from the wall. And then you've got the wonderful mix of local and imported materials here towards me. And then, of course, at the bottom, an array of stone detailed from different parts of the country, and the wonderful use of traditional finishes as well. By way of an example of another method of construction that we came across in the New Churches project, there's evidence of what appears to be the remains of render from a lot of these flint walls, and some form of framework for doors and windows. This apparent render on closer inspection seemed to be common with the construction mortar, and you perhaps sometimes could see the imprint of wickerwork on the heads of doors and windows. Archaeological evidence also came forward with the possibility that flintwork could have been built with shuttering, because otherwise it's like building with ball bearings. And the archaeological evidence was of post holes, not for scaffolding, but for shutter posts and bracing closer to the wall. So we carried out trials of shuttered flintwork repair at Rowdham St Andrew, and I think at the bottom you can see that with a few years of weathering, the appearance may well come close to what you see at the top, which is the medieval equivalent. There was also trials done looking at the use of flexible wicker hurdles to form shuttering for rounded structures such as the heads of doors and windows, and even perhaps round church towers. Always a conundrum if you've got an intractable flint. How do you actually map it or shape it to provide corners, and how do you actually construct round structures with it? If we move from churches to monastic sites, some of the posters around you may be familiar with. This is the wonderful iconic site of St Benet's Abbey on the River Bure in the Norfolk Broads. It was the first Benedictine abbey in Norfolk, founded in 1020, and it was never dissolved by Henry VIII. So Bishop Norwich has a service there once a year. He comes by wherry normally and has a service on the site. And as you can see over the years, it's been the subject of great interest. The Norwich School of Artists, John Cockman and others, and at the bottom the drawings by the Society of Antiquaries, recording the quirky site. You have a gatehouse built in about 1350, and within it a brick windmill. Mid-18th century, the sails blew off in 1863. A wonderful mismatch of materials. You have a church, or the remains of a church. You've got what are considered to be the most important and complete set of medieval fish ponds and water management systems on any site. You've got the remains of waterside buildings and structures, quays, a pub, checkers apparently, and all sorts of other building platforms, yet to fully be understood. Getting closer to it, the gatehouse and the wheel mill presented problems. Some of the problems were that people had done repair works in the past, and some of it was good, but we didn't know when and who by. The brickwork of the windmill tower had suffered over the years, not so much on the outside, but on the inside, with attrition by wind and grit blowing round in the vortex. The church, you can see on the top left, has a wooden cross. Said it wasn't dissolved. The bishop has his service, and that cross is made from oak from the Sandringham estate. You've got wonderful 15th century flushwork remaining on the church, and you've got some fairly good repairs that were probably done in the 1950s. We understand, as you look on that left-hand slide, as you're looking down the nave towards the altar, that was used as a silage clamp by the local farmer for many years, which explained why we were finding sheep netting and all sorts of things tucked into the bottom of the walls. And the precinct wall on the right is no more than knee height, sometimes less, close to the water channel, and being damaged by cattle grazing on the site every year. So the repairs followed a normal process, but it's always difficult to balance something like brickwork repair. If you replace the worst 100 bricks and you stand back, well then there's another worst 100 bricks and another worst 100 bricks. You have to draw the line somewhere, and that's normally by budget. But we were able to actually undertake more brickwork repair than we might have done at the beginning. We were able to get local students from the technical college to come, along with members of the public, conservation officers and others, to a day on site where there was flint mapping and looking at different mortars and consolidation practices. And of course, this was only a year or two ago. Things have moved on. We've now gone through the lime revival and the use of hydraulic limes. We're now talking about hot mixed limes, which may have a role in this sort of work in the future. And of course, the press got on with it. Also in Norfolk, we have St Mary's Friary, or Greyfriars, at Walsingham, a wonderful site in private ownership by Walsingham Estate. It's a scheduled monument with a domestic building right in the middle of it. The site, the building's then listed, and it's in a conservation area, so you have all of those designations. And with the Natural England grant under their high-level stewardship scheme, funding was available to conserve only 3 parts based upon a prioritised condition survey I carried out in 2006. So we're looking at the guest house, the chapter house, and the little cloister. And you can see some of the challenges. The structural cracking and loose high-level masonry. Ivy grew with some of the strands or stems as thick as my arm behind that vulnerable flint facing, forcing it off. Ivy and other invasive vegetation shattering the little cloister tracery windows. And then at the bottom you can see on the left the east elevation of the chapter house as it was, and then as it was not, it collapsed and sent all the fill out. But every cloud has a silver lining. It allowed the archaeologists then to have a good look, and we now understand that that structure was possibly 2-storey in height. We'll come back to some of the evidence. So these were taken literally weeks ago. The project has now come to completion, and we've learned so much about that guest house, the way it was constructed and possibly altered in terms of its use partway through the construction process, how a first floor was put in by putting corbels at one end and knocking a hole through and then threading the beam through from one side, engaging it on the corbel at the far side, and then supporting it on the corbel on the near side. How that span of timber was clearly too great, and there were no other corbels, but clearly there was a first floor because there was a stairway, so that first floor was possibly freestanding on timber posts down. Of course, no evidence remaining. Multiple openings, blocked, opened, partially opened, blocked again. You've got this whole story of different uses, including, inevitably, as a farm building. The chapter house is a fascinating structure. We, if you look at the buttresses, found that all of the buttresses on all of the buildings were angle buttresses, so coming away from the corner like that. You can see the chapter house as a diagonal buttress, narrow, almost like a pilaster. But we found on the base of a much larger, earlier angle buttress. So quite clearly this was a larger structure, giving credence to this idea of a 2-storey building. Excavation down within didn't find a floor. We found some benching around the side, so we could give ourselves a comfortable margin for any work from above down to about 1/2 metre without disturbing archaeological layers. And soft capping around the wall head, just to allow people to understand that although this structure was represented as a romantic ruin in the 18th century, clearly it did extend further up, and that's why the soft capping is quite useful rather than a clean, crisp mortar line separating the top of the wall. And the little cloister, again the problem being protection, but we were allowed to rebuild part of the wall head to load those arches and to consolidate the vulnerable clunch work on the side and the inevitable protection for nearly 18 months while the mortar set up and hardened. Moving to more modern times and to finish, there are issues often complex and possibly less rehearsed than with earlier remains to be addressed with industrial sites. In the 1960s, when town gas was being phased out in favour of natural gas, many of these sites, and remember most towns and certainly all of the cities had gasworks, were cleared of this dirty, smelly industrial process, to the point where actually Fakenham in Norfolk remained as the only small horizontal gasworks left in England and Wales, scheduled as an ancient monument. And you have the wonderful remains of the gas holder, the retort house, the retorts within for baking or cooking the coal, the oxide shed, and as it's a museum to the gas industry, a wonderful collection of gas cookers, gas meters, gas appliances, and the inevitable ground contamination from that gas making process. I think probably every gasworks has the same apocryphal stories but apparently the gas purification process was partially done underwater, and the gas was bubbled through trays with lime or bog iron ore, and this could be taken out and spread on the ground in the oxide shed and allowed, I think the term was revivification, and it could be then used 3 or 4 times. Now apparently if your child had whooping cough, you'd send the child to the local gasworks to walk around in the oxide shed and breathe this in. Of course now we know it's carcinogenic, but the children were sent there. And on a Sunday, of course, when everyone was cooking their Sunday lunch and you wanted a bit more pressure for the cookers, the gaswork manager used to sit on the gas holder to read his Sunday newspaper. I'm sure every site has the same stories. And at Plesley Pit in Nottinghamshire, this was a site with mines sunk in 1870, producing coal until 1983. You can see the remaining headstocks, engine house and steam winders, scheduled again as an ancient monument. But here and at the gasworks we have this issue. What about the plant and machinery? The primary legislation, the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act 1979, includes the plant and machinery as part of the scheduled designation. So when you're consolidating, you should be taking the same approach with plant and machinery. But the best people to do any work are by and large the people who worked on these sites during their heyday. So the importance of volunteers is much greater. And at Fakenham Gasworks, for instance, we agreed that we could continue to run some of the machinery to use compressed air to keep the lift in that gas holder going until such time as the volunteers retired and gave up or were no longer interested. But of course, if you run this important machinery, you wear it out. If you don't run it, it seizes and corrodes. So you have that conundrum. You also have on the right here the conundrum of the headstock. Clearly steel, it was corroding, it was encased in concrete, now the concrete's failing. So do you repair the concrete, or do you take the concrete off and repair the underlying original structure? It's a bit like Thor's hammer, isn't it? You replace the shaft and the head, is it still Thor's hammer? So where do you draw the line in terms of repair and replacement? And lastly, as a final example, and one currently in the news, returned to St Peter's Seminary near Glasgow. This is Scotland's most significant modernist building, and yet it's in ruins. It was built in 1966 and abandoned in 1980, and is extensive. But the current proposal is for stabilisation and restoration with various degrees of ruinedness, if that is a correct term. And new use in part of the site as an international venue for public art and knowledge exchange through concerts, art events and education projects. So, by way of summary, or at least a possibly naive wish list for a future, I'd like to see greater, or even some, consideration given to traditional materials and methods of construction in mainstream architecture education. Better coordinated craft training opportunities, dissemination of practical information at grassroots level, better means of procuring work where there's opportunity to coordinate more closely with the contractor and break the still us and them attitude that's still common. Alternatives to competitive tendering for conservation work with its insidious emphasis on cost rather than quality, and a more balanced approach to projects involving protected species. In essence, I want things to remain the same, but get much better, much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
What a storyteller. Fantastic. I hope there are, and I'm sure there will be, any number of questions. And I'd like whoever raises their hand to say who they are and their affiliation, so David gets a chance to understand the question in a bit more depth. Please.
I'm Keith Webb. I'm a second-year CHA student at the University of Reading. I have 2 questions, so I'll tie them in together and then you can choose if you guys want to. You kept on mentioning that you didn't know who had been there and done work on the sites previously. How are you making steps to document your work so that future generations know what's being done? And that kind of ties in with some of the conservation practices of reversible treatments or conservation. Can you talk about that?
Some of the more complex projects are based on producing a conservation management plan. So we have the luxury of research at the beginning of the project. But so many of the smaller projects, possibly funded by the owners themselves, do not start the conservation management plan, so you do not have the luxury in the private sector of the time or the cost of doing the documentary and archive research. So it's important to get the information at the beginning. How we're documenting it is typically with the scheduled monuments. There's a condition on the scheduled monument consent for the recording before and after. Now that could be quite simply photography, photogrammetry, laser scan, whatever, but it's been recorded in that manner. There's also, this sounds very dry, CDM regulations. There's something called the health and safety file. So all of the construction details are being recorded in that. So the mortars, where you did the work and so on and so forth.
And where are those kept?
Those are kept by the owner. So the health and safety file is kept by the owner, and it should be made available to anybody carrying out work in the future. In Norfolk, we've been lucky in that Susanna Wade-Martins has published a book this year called The Conservation Movement in Norfolk, where she admits to the problem of finding information out about previous work. I think so much of it was done by the Ministry of Works, the Department of the Environment, predecessors of English Heritage, and the information may exist somewhere, but quite often if you go to the repositories, it's not there. So over time you can winkle out information, but it's quite difficult. You might have to remind me what the second part of your question is now.
The idea of reversible treatments.
For us, we are, as I said, looking at mortars as a technical solution, so we're not slavishly following the mortar that had been used previously. So in a way, the mortars are sacrificial, as any good mortar should be. So in that regard, it is, I suppose, reversible in as much as it's going to fail before the primary material fails. We tend to shy away from structural interventions, steel and concrete and so on and so forth, where they're not going to be reversible. But in the case at Walsingham of the Chapter House, because we'd had the failure of that east wall, it had fallen out, clearly we had the two walls flapping around, and so there had to be an intervention. In that case, there were tie rods going across from north to south, tying them together, and then going from the east back to tie that east elevation back in, that brick back in. So all of that was documented because that was far more invasive than we would normally try. But most of our work is minimalist, because we can't afford to do anything else, using materials that are sacrificial, and when necessary, if it's invasive, we'll record it.
Thank you, David. Yes, question at the back, thank you.
Stephen Bradley, recent graduate from the MSc program here at the Institute of Sustainable Heritage. I've got a question to pursue a little bit more community involvement. You've mentioned in a number of parts of your talk the involvement partly in open days, partly in retrieving knowledge from the local community. Could you just expand a little bit on what you see as being the opportunities and the limitations of involving the community in this kind of preservation work?
In part, it goes back to my former answer. If you are producing a conservation management plan, you're necessarily looking at who the stakeholders are. On some of the small projects, and certainly the private projects, there's a disinclination to publicise the work widely. There's sites behind tall walls, and that's how they wish it to remain. On the projects that are funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund and by Natural England, quite often there is a requirement, certainly with the HLF funded projects, for public engagement, and that's where the open days come in. But increasingly, in a world where we have less and less apprenticeships and less people coming forward to do this sort of work, what we're desperately trying to do is engage with the public to try and give a spark of interest. And by and large, inevitably, it's the older generation who are coming to these open days, which is why we're really keen to talk to medical colleges and get people on construction courses. But, you know, if you were a teenager doing a bricklaying course and it's a 3-year course and you can earn a good salary after 2 years, it's a hard decision to make to go back and do year 3 if all you're going to learn is something that's fairly specialised and it's not going to give you much increased income. So we struggle, and that's where I think community engagement comes in. In terms of how we do it on a formal basis, we tend to approach parish councils and parochial church councils simply that way, and let them come to meetings and be part of the project team right from the beginning. So important, even down to individual sites like churches. You engage with the parochial church council. Inevitably, they have interest in stories, sometimes accurate, sometimes not, but it's all good information. And on something like St Benet's Abbey, we had a whole raft of engagement through things like molehill surveys, graffiti surveys, and other types of activity. Once the project is done, we are in the hands by and large of volunteers. At the beginning, I said there was publicity for this group in the Cotswolds looking after their barrows. I think it's desperate that we have volunteers helping us with funding being reduced, and what funding that is available is for capital projects. A lot of these trusts have very little revenue funding to support maintenance. So I think the role of volunteers and informed volunteers and how one educates those volunteers is another matter, is an important issue. I hope that covers all of the points that we've raised in the question.
Very good, thank you.
Please. I'm Anthony Malkin, I'm a freelance archives consultant. I wanted to ask you about sort of international aspect of the work, whether you've been informed by teams working on some projects abroad, whether your work has helped inform other people's work. Is there much communication European projects?
Yes, from my perspective, I haven't. But in a former life, an academic life, certainly there were projects where we were talking to other countries about, for instance, lighthouses. And there was a huge difference in the approach, largely driven by ownership. In the case of lighthouses, quite often they're owned by the military in different countries. On the consolidation of monuments, however, I've got to put up my hand and say we've had no involvement with other groups. When you turn to the cathedrals and monument ruins, clearly there is a movement, and there's a wonderful opportunity for stonemasons to travel around the world as almost journeymen and gain experience as you go around. So, no, it's something to consider, certainly. I know that in other countries, Italy comes to mind, they take a fairly robust approach to things that we would perhaps do with kid gloves. Is it? Right.
I was thinking partly in terms of, within my sphere anyway, that when you're looking internationally, sometimes you can't use the same solution, particularly because of climate. Often the materials are used are not suitable in one kind of another, so I just wondered partly from that perspective whether it's something to adapt to.
Oh yes, certainly. I was told a wonderful story. I worked in India for a short while, and they had an international consultant give advice on mold growth in a library and said, open the windows, forgetting they had monsoons. So yes, there are transferable knowledge and skills, and we did work with the Archaeological Survey of India over a number of years, and I was standing in Bombay and being quoted PPG 15 at me by a structural engineer with absolutely no relevance to conservation practice in India, but he'd been taught it in this country. So yes, I think you've got to be careful what you take and use. But it's an interesting point, because I'd love to know how they deal with these things in France and Italy and elsewhere.
I'm Matthias Sturridge, UCL, Institute for Sustainable Heritage. I wonder how the principles and ethics will apply to more contemporary materials. You touched briefly upon concrete, and I was really interested I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about the approach that you will take there. But even looking at more contemporary materials such as glass and perhaps even rapid prototype constructions, what will be the approach there, do you think?
That's an interesting one, and it goes back to the point I made, what is going to be of value and significance in the future? Any disposable age, are these materials going to actually have any cumulative history and value? On the concrete, there are recognised techniques for repair and consolidation, but they're fairly invasive. If you're removing and adding back, that may well be acceptable if a building has got function. I would be interested to see the approaches they take at the seminary in Glasgow, for instance, where part of it is going to remain a ruin. And I think there's a degree of decay that is perhaps required by the audience of ruins. It goes back to what we want our ruins to be. I mean, we've gone through this romantic period in the 18th and 19th centuries where we wanted that sublime and romantic and Gothic sense of a ruin. Now I get the sense that some of the industrial buildings that have been turned into very interesting sites of use, for instance, Germany and other examples, must lead the way, but I think inevitably the original fabric is going to be treated more robustly, perhaps, in our medieval fabric. In terms of techniques, I don't know. I think at the moment all we've got is a range of techniques where we're either going to cut out and replace or consolidate, and that's inevitably the resins.
David, you alluded to the fact that we are living in quite challenging economic times, and I wondered how the repairs that are being done, what is their longevity, how long they will last, and what the cycle is likely to look like in the future for that repair and maintenance cycle in that context.
It's always a question that I have to pose and pose to myself in dealing with ruins is, what is the acceptable condition for the owner? If it's a building that you live in, by and large you don't want it to leak and smell, and you want it to be dry and warm. For a lot of my ruins, it's a case that bits don't fall off either onto visitors or onto grass where people are mowing the grass. So, in a way, how we tackle it, how we prioritise the work is very different from a normal standing building. How we move forward and look at the cycle is a fascinating one, because a lot of the work, as I say, is on the back of capital grants with no revenue funding. So I approach a project and I say we are safeguarding original fabric, we're stabilising it, and to the client that doesn't mean bits are not going to fall off. There will inevitably be erosion and the inevitable piece of stone and water that falls. But we like to think at 30 to 40 years, no more. But of course, in a church process where you have a quinquennial inspection and you put your urgent, necessary and desirable wish list together, and then you go back 5 years and 5 years and 5 years, and haven't even done the urgent things, we need to have another category of urgent. And I think some of the ruins now, particularly the private owned ones, all you need to do is look at the Heritage Risk Register to see how many ruin structures are on in a fairly private state, to begin to think, well, where's the funding into the future?
Adopt a ruin.
Adopt a ruin, certainly, and I think it's going to be an adopt a church very soon as well, if you look at how the funding is going for works to churches. Yes, so my benchmark is 30 to 40 years, a generation.
Any more questions? I have another one. You mentioned right at the very start, you alluded to original fabric. What do you mean by original fabric? What is original fabric?
Maybe I have too many clients who are archaeologists and I pick up these terms. One of my clients, as the former director of the Norfolk Archaeological Trust, had a very clear line. He said, you can do this and no more because you cannot create archaeology. So I think it's a term that inspectors of ancient monuments use.
Okay.
It's original fabric, and that is the primary fabric, and we will do what we need to do to protect that. And if you've got a ruined wall, if you put another 300 millimetres of material on the top, yes, you are creating archaeology in the sense that you're presenting something that's modern, but you're actually protecting perhaps the wall head of a Roman structure underneath. So that's what drives this sort of approach to ancient monuments. Maybe we ought to be a little bit more robust. Sometimes we have too much of a light touch. but it's the original fabric that really is sacrosanct.
But at what point does an intervention on original fabric becomes an integral part of its history?
Yeah. Yes. And
How do you know it was original? It might have been, fallen down. And
Could you introduce yourself, please? Go on.
Sorry, I'm Oliver Smith, I'm an architect.
Oh, right, okay. Well, it's a good question. It's that cumulative history, isn't it? And it's separating out how many values and significance there is. And I would like to think that at
And it's
Greyfriars,
rating our own values and
Yes.
conclusions as zero.
on the Walsingham side at Greyfriars, the fact that we had an opening told us something. The fact it was blocked told us something. The fact that then somebody within that large opening and its blocking created a smaller opening told us something. And the fact that that was then subsequently blocked told us something.
But you didn't reverse that, you left it.
We left it. Yes, we left it. But it needs an awful lot of unpicking. And this is where this work relies so much on an interdisciplinary approach. I've been very lucky to work with people like Stephen Hayward, medievalists, and a number of archaeologists on these structures, because you really need to understand, to unpick what is original and what is important but not original. The phasing is crucial. And it's sometimes only when you're doing work, so late as actually you're on the scaffolding unpicking, do you actually find something that goes, oh yes, well actually you've got a splayed opening there, that matches that one there, that must have been a door, not a window. So you are learning all the way along, and I think we rarely have the luxury of starting a project knowing all we need to know about the site. And that's why when I did the specifications, there's healthy sums for engaging archaeologists and ecologists and structural engineers all the way through the process. There's got to be, because you can lose so much original fabric by misinterpreting at the beginning. More so when you're dealing with something like Castle Acre, where the precinct walls were buried under ivy. I had to write a specification without actually seeing the masonry. It was hope for the best, plan for the worst. That's not a bad motto for writing specifications.
So does that mean, if I could push this a little bit further, that when it comes to ruins and archaeology, there's less opportunity to add value in a present sense to that ruin and archaeology, to the ruins and archaeology, in the way that when you have a building that has to continue to be in use as part of its preservation, that you would add value because it needs to adapt, so to speak.
Well, it's such a challenge because if you take St Benet's Abbey in Florence, when you talk to people, visitor surveys, the one thing they said was, it's the quiet, tranquil space. And yet if you put activities into that tranquil space, you're destroying what makes it so important. So there's a balancing act always in terms of what you should and shouldn't do. Sorry, you your hand.
Well, another question, but this one actually maybe for me. But Peter Helm in Oxford, the economist and in the Treasury, is doing a lot of work on the value of our natural assets. I'm not sure he's extending that to our built heritage, but is there not a very strong argument for saying that? Economists are very good at measuring the value of everything.
Yes.
What, should we be putting a value on these standards?
Are you talking about monetary value?
A monetary value, because that's the way of
social value.
that is a way of leveraging revenue.
But social value as well.
They can value that. They can put monetary values on all these things as a way of leveraging the funding to maintain these things.
I mentioned that quite often ruins have natural capital, in as much as you have protected species and national scarce this, that and the other growing upon them. But actually that's of interest to a very small part of the community. How one actually adds value in a more meaningful sense is always a challenge, and each site is so different. Those augmented reality apps are being trialled at that site, and we'll see if that increases the footfall. But actually it's an open access site. You don't have to pay to go there. So it's not going to generate any more income for the trust. at St Benet's Abbey there is a talking bench which you can sit on and have a fairly interesting accent tell you what the site is. But actually you don't want to do more on that site because that's its great charm. The fact it is such an iconic, quiet, secluded site. St Mary's Church, Applin Hill, the church with the wall paintings, has more services than the Church of England church in the next parish. So of course it's upset them. And the number of people who turn up to those services is too great for the church, so they hold them in the churchyard. And there is a waiting list for people to not be buried, they're not accepting burials, but interment of ashes and other services at that church because it's such a special place and this cuts across all faith groups. So I suppose that's added value. And it's turned it into a church where there has to be a presence 7 days a week, but it has a knock-on effect of the pressure of people going in and looking at the wall paintings and the inevitable contact with the paintings. I mean, we went through all sorts of hurdles. We designed seating so that you could have in a collegiate style the paintings so that because the walls were battered, if you had a service and nodded off, your head wouldn't touch the wall. You had spaces designed. So we went to that level of detail.
I'm going to release David from this inquisition and to thank you for a very interesting lecture, thought-provoking, and for taking so many questions and answers. And I'm going to invite you all for drinks up on the first floor where we can continue the conversation over a drink. So I hope that you will all join us upstairs and join me in thanking David. Upstairs on the first floor. And those of you who know the place, if you could guide those who look lost, I'd be very grateful.